Hey guys, tonight, we journey back in time far from the hustle and bustle of modern life to a place of quiet contemplation and meticulous work. Imagine waking up, not to the glow of a screen or the rumble of traffic, but to the faint clang of a bell echoing down a stone corridor. It's cold. Really, truly cold, the kind that seeps into your bones and makes you question all your life choices, particularly the one about becoming a monk. You're in a monastery in medieval Europe, and your job is perhaps one of the quietest, most important, and frankly most demanding in this era. You are a scribe. You probably won't survive a medieval winter without serious wool layers, just putting that out there. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you in the comments below. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. That bell you heard. That's the signal for matins, the first prayer service of the day often held in the deep dark hours before dawn. As a monk and a scribe, your day is structured by the strict rhythms of the monastic schedule, a life punctuated by prayer, communal meals, and work. And your work, the copying of texts, requires light. Natural light primarily, which means your working day begins as early as humanly possible, dictated by the sun's slow ascent. You push yourself up from your simple bed, perhaps a straw-filled mattress on a wooden frame. The air bites at your skin. You pull on your rough wool tunic and robe layers, being key to survival in these often unheated stone buildings. Fumbling for your sandals in the gloom, you might light a small candle or oil lamp. Just enough light to navigate your small cell in the corridors without tripping over a fellow monk who had the same idea about needing some illumination. This is not the bright, instant light we're used to. It's a hesitant, flickering glow that casts long, dancing shadows and makes everything seem a bit more mysterious, or just harder to see clearly. Stepping out of your cell, you join the silent procession of robed figures moving towards the monastery church. The stone floors are frigid under your sandals. The only sounds are soft footsteps, the rustle of wool, and the occasional cough. Monastic life, particularly for certain orders, emphasized silence or sigillum as a form of discipline and contemplation. Meaning, no cheerful, "Good morning, Brother Benedict." Lovely dawn, chatter in the corridors. You're expected to maintain silence except when necessary for prayer or specific tasks. Imagine trying to get through your entire morning commute without speaking. Tough, right? The matin service itself is long conducted largely from memory or by the dim light of strategically placed lamps in the church. It's a period of prayer and chanting, a spiritual awakening before the physical and intellectual work of the day begins. As you chant or listen, your mind might already be drifting towards the scriptorium, the room where you will spend the bulk of your day. You anticipate the feel of the quill in your hand, the smooth surface of the parchment, the text waiting to be copied. Monasteries were the primary centers of learning and book production in the early Middle Ages. While the ancient world had libraries and scribes, the knowledge often became fragmented or lost after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. It was in places like this, the monasteries, that the work of preserving and transmitting texts was undertaken. Your role as a scribe is not just a job. It's a calling, a dedication to preserving knowledge for future generations, and a form of spiritual devotion in itself. Copying sacred texts was seen as a way to engage deeply with the divine word. A mainstream historical fact is that monastic scriptoria were crucial in preserving classical and religious texts during the Middle Ages, acting as centers of literacy and scholarship when it was declining elsewhere. Without scribes like you, much of the literature, philosophy, and religious writings of the ancient world would have been lost forever. Think of all the cat videos that wouldn't exist if these guys hadn't bothered. After matins, there might be a brief period for personal prayer or a small cold meal before the main work begins. But the pull of the scriptorium is strong, especially as the sky outside begins to lighten. Natural light is your most valuable commodity. While lamps or candles could be used for brief periods or specific tasks like illuminating a particularly intricate initial, they were smoky, expensive oil or wax cost money, and provided a poor quality of light for sustained, detailed work like copying fine script. Firelight in the form of lamps or candles was primarily for navigating the dark hours, not for the precise art of transcription. So, as the first hints of gray appear in the sky, you gather your few essential tools and head towards the scriptorium. The other monks might be moving to their own assigned tasks, working in the fields, the kitchen, the infirmary. Your path leads you to the heart of the monastery's intellectual life, a place dedicated to silence, focus, and the slow, careful work of the hand and eye. A quirky tidbit is that some monastic rules were so strict about silence that monks developed a complex system of hand signals to communicate their needs in the scriptorium, like asking for more ink or a fresh piece of parchment without speaking. Imagine having to learn a whole new language just to ask for a pencil. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation for scribal work in monasteries was purely religious devotion and the preservation of sacred texts, or if there was also a significant element of practical necessity, copying legal documents, historical records, or even texts for sale to wealthy patrons. It was likely a mix, but the emphasis on copying religious works was certainly central. It's hard to know how many monks were truly passionate about preserving ancient Greek philosophy versus just doing the job they were assigned. As you walk towards the scriptorium, the monastery is gradually coming to life, but the atmosphere remains subdued, quiet. The early morning chill is still in the air, a constant companion in these stone halls. Your mind is clearing after sleep and prayer, preparing for the intense focus required for the hours ahead. You are about to enter a space dedicated to the quiet transmission of knowledge, a place where the only sounds will be the scratching of quills and the turning of pages. Your quiet life as a scribe is about to begin for the day. You arrive at the scriptorium door. It's likely a sturdy wooden door, perhaps plain or with minimal decoration. Pushing it open, you step into the room that will be your world for much of the day. The air here is often cool, sometimes damp, carrying the faint scent of ink, parchment, and old paper. The most striking thing, however, is the quiet. The scriptorium, from the Latin word scribere, meaning to write, was the designated place for the scribes to work. It was often located in a part of the monastery that allowed for good natural light, perhaps on the upper floor, or with windows facing a courtyard. Sometimes it might be situated near a warmer part of the monastery, like the kitchen or the calefactory, a heated warming room, as ink could freeze in very cold temperatures, and frankly, nobody enjoys trying to write when their fingers are numb. A mainstream historical fact is that scriptoria were carefully positioned within monasteries to maximize the limited natural light available throughout the day, as artificial light sources were unsuitable for detailed writing. The room itself is simple, functional. Along the walls, particularly where the windows are located, are desks or carrels. These might be individual wooden desks, sometimes built into the wall or partitioned, to give each scribe a small private workspace. The desk surface is often sloped, making it easier to lean over the large books and pieces of parchment you'll be working on. Your desk is plain, made of sturdy wood, perhaps scarred by years of quill knives and stray ink blots. Your seat is a simple wooden bench or stool. Comfort is secondary to function. Other scribes are already here, having arrived directly after matins. They are seated at their desks, silent, already engrossed in their work. The only sounds are the soft scratch, scratch, scratch of quills on parchment, and the gentle rustle as pages are turned. It's a symphony of quiet diligence. The rule of silent sigillum is particularly strict in the scriptorium. This is a place of concentration where mistakes are costly and time-consuming to correct. Chit-chat is not only discouraged, it's often forbidden entirely. You learned those hand signals for a reason. Remember, asking for the ink pot involved a specific gesture, probably less expressive than charades but effective. You move to your own desk, one of many in a row, strategically placed to catch the best light from the window. Even though it's still early, the light is starting to filter in a gray, cool light that will gradually strengthen as the sun rises higher. You unpack your tools, your bundle of quills, your small knife for sharpening them, a pot of ink, or perhaps several for different colors, a ruler, or straight edge a bone folder for smoothing parchment. And most importantly, the text you will be copying, the exemplar. This might be a large, heavy manuscript placed on a stand or propped open on your desk. Setting up your workspace is a quiet ritual. You arrange your tools just so. You open the exemplar text to where you left off yesterday. You select a piece of parchment, smooth and pale, ready to receive the words. You dip your quill in the ink, careful not to take too much. And then you pause, take a breath, and prepare to begin the slow, painstaking process of transferring the words from the exemplar onto your blank page. The atmosphere in the scriptorium is one of focused intensity, yet it also feels strangely peaceful. There's a shared purpose, a collective dedication to the task at hand. You are part of a long tradition, a human link in the chain of knowledge transmission, stretching back centuries. The silence isn't just a rule, it's a necessary condition for the work. It allows for concentration for the deep immersion in the text you are copying. It's the original quiet quitting, but for holy reasons. A quirky tidbit about scriptoria is that some had a specific slightly raised desk or platform for the armarius, the monk in charge of the library and the scriptorium. He would oversee the work, distribute materials, and ensure silence was maintained. Imagine having the job of silently supervising a room full of silently working people. He was basically the medieval version of a librarian with extra authority and a potential side-eye for anyone who shuffled their feet too loudly. Historians still argue about the typical temperature and comfort levels in scriptoria, especially in winter. Were they genuinely freezing places where monks suffered for their art? Or were they sometimes heated by braziers or located near warmer parts of the monastery, making conditions more bearable? The scattered evidence from monastic rules and chronicles gives a mixed picture, and the reality likely varied greatly depending on the wealth and location of the monastery. It's hard to know how many ink pots actually froze solid. As you sit at your desk, the cool air on your face, the smell of ink filling your nostrils, the faint sound of other quills scratching around you, you feel a sense of quiet purpose settling over you. The world outside the monastery walls with its noise and chaos feels very distant. In here, there is order, silence, and the timeless task of copying words. You are ready to begin the work of the day, illuminated by the gradually strengthening light and the quiet dedication of your fellow scribes. The stillness of the scriptorium envelops you. Your workspace is set up. The silence of the scriptorium wraps around you. Before you can put quill to skin, you need that skin to be ready. In the medieval world, especially for important books and documents, you weren't writing on paper like we use today. Paper existed, but it was rare, expensive, and often seen as less durable than the material that defined scribal work for centuries: parchment and vellum. What is parchment? It's animal skin, typically sheep, goat, or calf, that has been specially prepared to create a smooth, durable writing surface. Vellum is technically made from calf skin, and it's usually considered the finest quality, smoother and paler than parchment from other animals. But often the terms were used interchangeably. Think of it as the ancient version of high-quality paper, except from an animal. The process of making parchment was long, smelly, and required considerable skill, usually done by specialized craftsmen called parchmenters. The animal skin would be cleaned of flesh and hair, soaked in a lime solution for days or weeks to help remove fat and loosen hair, then stretched tightly on a frame. While stretched, both sides would be scraped meticulously with a curved knife to make them thin and uniform. Then it was dried under tension and finally smoothed and sometimes treated with chalk or pumice powder to prepare the surface for ink. It was a lot of work just to get a blank page. A mainstream historical fact is that the preparation of parchment was a complex and labor-intensive craft, and its cost contributed significantly to the expense of producing manuscripts. Imagine the sheer number of animals required to make a single large Bible. As a scribe, you receive this prepared skin in large sheets. Your first task is to inspect it. You hold the piece up to the light filtering through the scriptorium window, looking for imperfections, thin spots, holes, scars. Yes, animals got scars, and sometimes they ended up on the parchment. Adds character, right? You feel the surface. The flesh side, which was the inside of the skin, is usually smoother and whiter, while the hair side, the outside, might be slightly darker and show faint pores where the hair grew. Both sides are used, but scribes often had a preference, and you'd try to arrange the sheets in a book so that flesh faced flesh and hair faced hair for a more consistent look. Consistency was key even when dealing with animal skin. You might need to cut the large sheet down to the size required for your specific manuscript. This is done carefully with a knife. Then you need to prepare the surface for writing. Even though it's been smoothed by the parchmenter, you might use a piece of pumice stone or a bone folder, a smooth, flat piece of bone, to rub the surface, gently making it as smooth and uniform as possible. This helps the ink flow evenly and prevents the quill from snagging. It's a repetitive, calming motion preparing your canvas. Once the surface is smooth, you need to rule the page. This is crucial for keeping your lines of text straight and your margins consistent. You don't draw visible lines with a pencil that you'll erase. Instead, you use a blunt stylus, a pointed piece of bone or metal, or sometimes a lead point which made very faint lines to make indentations or marks in the parchment. You use a ruler or a straight edge to guide your stylus, creating faint lines across the page where your lines of text will sit, and also marking the boundaries for your margins. In some cases, you might prick tiny holes along the edge of the page and then use a ruler to connect the dots across the sheet. This painstaking process ensures that your beautiful script doesn't wander all over the page like a drunken spider. The sound of ruling is a soft scrape, 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 or a quiet press as the stylus makes its mark on the skin. It's a foundational sound of the scriptorium, quiet but constant. This ruling process is vital. A poorly ruled page makes for a messy, inconsistent manuscript, no matter how skilled your hand is. A quirky tidbit about ruling is that some scribes would rule both sides of the parchment at once by pressing hard enough with the stylus or using a tool called a ruling board with raised lines that indented the sheet when pressed against it. 2 for the price of 1 scrape. Historians still argue about the exact techniques and tools used for ruling parchment in different scriptoria and different periods. Did they always prick the sheets first, or did some simply freehand it with a ruler? Were lead points common, or were blind indentations the norm? The evidence from surviving manuscripts shows variations suggesting local practices and available tools played a big role. It's hard to definitively say how your stylus or ruling board compared to a scribe's in a different monastery. As you finish ruling your sheet of parchment, you run your hand over the surface, feeling the faint indentations, the subtle difference between the flesh and hair sides. It feels ready. It smells faintly animalistic, a reminder of its origins, but also of its transformation into a vessel for words and knowledge. This piece of carefully prepared skin with its precise faint lines is now ready for the next step, the application of ink, the beginning of the actual writing. You have prepared your canvas. Now you need your colors. Your parchment lies before you, carefully ruled and ready. Now you need the substance that will transform this blank skin into a page of text, the ink. And not just ink for writing, but potentially vibrant colors for initials, headings, and illustrations. In the medieval scriptorium, inks and pigments weren't simply bought ready-made in bottles like your modern printer cartridges. They had to be prepared often right there in the monastery from raw ingredients. The basic writing ink was typically black or a very dark brown. There were 2 main types commonly used. One was carbon-based, made from soot collected from lamps or wood smoke, mixed with a binder like gum arabic, a resin from acacia trees, and a liquid, usually water, but sometimes wine or vinegar. The other common type was iron gall ink, made from the tannins in gall nuts lumps that grow on oak trees when wasps lay eggs in them. Yes, really, thanks wasps, mixed with iron sulfate and a binder. Making black ink was a bit of a process. If you were making carbon ink, you'd collect soot, perhaps scraping it from the inside of a lamp chimney if they had those, or just where the smoke collected. Then you'd grind it into a fine powder, mix it with the gum arabic, which helped suspend the carbon particles and made the ink stick to the parchment, and add liquid until you got the right consistency. If you were making iron gall ink, you'd steep the gall nuts to extract the tannins, add the iron sulfate, often from rusty iron filings, and then the binder. The mixture would start pale but darken as it oxidized, eventually becoming a deep, dark color. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval scribes primarily used carbon-based or iron gall inks for writing, and both types required careful preparation to achieve the desired consistency and permanence. The smell of the ink could vary. Carbon ink might just smell faintly smoky, or of the binder. Iron gall ink could sometimes have a slightly metallic or even vinegary smell, depending on how it was made. Neither was likely to be a fragrant perfume, but you got used to it. You kept your ink in small pots on your desk, covered to prevent it from drying out or attracting unwelcome visitors like flies, which would be a particularly annoying ink imperfection. Beyond the basic writing ink, there was a whole palette of colors used for adding life and beauty to the manuscripts. Red was very common for headings, initial letters, the large decorative first letter of a section, and important words. This was called rubrication, from the Latin rubrica for red earth or red chalk. A common red pigment was vermilion or cinnabar, derived from a mercury ore. It was a vibrant, almost orangey red. Another red came from madder root or even from crushed insects like the kermes insect. Blue pigments were often highly prized and expensive. Lapis lazuli, a semi-precious stone imported from Afghanistan, was ground to produce the brilliant deep blue known as ultramarine. This was incredibly costly and reserved for the most important manuscripts or patrons. More affordable blues came from minerals like azurite or plants like woad. Greens often came from copper compounds or plants. Yellows from arsenic sulfides, careful with that, saffron or plant dyes. White from lead or chalk. Preparing these pigments involved meticulous grinding. You'd use a mortar and pestle, often made of stone or glass, to grind hard mineral pigments into the finest possible powder. The finer the grind, the smoother and more vibrant the paint would be. This was slow, repetitive work, transforming rough lumps of rock or dried plants into brilliant dust. Then the powder would be mixed with a binder. For colored paints, egg white glare was commonly used, or sometimes gum arabic or animal glue. This mixture had to be just the right consistency, not too thick to apply, not too thin to run. A quirky tidbit is that some medieval pigment recipes included some truly odd ingredients like earwax spit, or even urine, which were believed to help the pigment bind or achieve a certain color. Apparently, ancient art could be biological. The process of preparing inks and pigments wasn't always done by the scribe themselves, especially in larger scriptoria. There might be specialized monks or lay assistants responsible for this messy and sometimes finicky work. But as a scribe, you needed to understand the materials you were working with, their properties, how they would interact with the parchment. The quality of your writing and illustration depended not just on your hand, but on the quality of your ink and paints. Historians still argue about the division of labor within medieval scriptoria. Were scribes always also illuminators and pigment preparers, or were these specialized roles particularly in larger monasteries with extensive book production? The evidence suggests a mix with some highly skilled individuals capable of everything, while others might have focused solely on copying text with illumination and pigment preparation done by others. It's hard to know if you as the scribe ground your own ultramarine or if someone else did the smelly, expensive work. As you look at your pots of ink and color, you see not just fluids and powders, but potential. The black ink is the voice of the text itself, the transmission of knowledge. The colors are the embellishments, the beauty that will draw the eye and help explain or highlight the words. You dip your quill into the black ink, feeling the familiar viscosity. The smell is faint but distinct. You are ready to bring words to life on the page, armed with your carefully prepared tools and colors. You have your prepared parchment smooth and faintly lined. You have your pots of ink black and perhaps some color ready to flow. Now you need the crucial tool that connects your hand and mind to the page, the quill. For centuries before the invention of metal pens, the sharpened feather of a bird was the standard writing instrument in Europe. Not just any feather would do, though you could probably make one work in a pinch. The best quills came from large birds, typically geese, swans, or crows. The primary flight feathers were preferred usually from the left wing because of the way the feather curves, making it more comfortable for a right-handed writer. Finding good quality feathers was important. They needed to be mature with a sturdy hollow shaft. A mainstream historical fact is that goose quills were the most commonly used writing instrument in medieval Europe, prized for their flexibility and the structure of their shaft. Imagine trying to write a whole book with a pigeon feather. Probably wouldn't work. Before a feather could become a pen, it needed some preparation. Sometimes the raw feathers were cured or hardened by heating them or soaking them in hot sand or ashes. This process helped to make the quill more durable and the nib hold its shape better. But the most important step was cutting the nib. This was a precise skill done with a special knife, appropriately called a quill knife. You hold the feather shaft in one hand and the sharp quill knife in the other. You carefully cut the end of the shaft at an angle, then make a slit up the middle. Then, with fine adjustments, you shape the point, cutting away small slivers of the feather until you create the flexible tip with the slit in the center. This slit is vital. It allows the ink to flow down from the reservoir inside the hollow shaft to the point of the nib, and also gives the nib flexibility to create different line widths depending on the pressure and angle. It's delicate work. One wrong cut and you've ruined the potential pen. It's like surgery but on a bird's discarded appendage. The type of script you were writing would influence how you cut the nib. For fine detailed scripts like Humanist Minuscule, you needed a sharp, relatively narrow point. For broader, more monumental scripts like Textura Quadrata, the Gothic script often seen in illuminated manuscripts, you'd need a wider, blunter nib that could produce thick downstrokes and thin horizontals with ease. As a scribe, you'd become highly skilled at cutting nibs to suit your particular hand and the script you were working on. The nib, once cut, wouldn't last forever. Writing on parchment, even well-prepared parchment, is abrasive. The point of the nib would wear down, become dull, and the slit might get clogged or damaged. This meant constant maintenance throughout the day. Every so often, you'd have to pause your writing, pick up your quill knife again, and carefully re-sharpen the nib. It was a necessary interruption, a moment to pause and tend to your most important tool. The sound of the quill knife scraping against the feather shaft is a quiet, focused sound in the scriptorium, distinct from the sound of writing. Your quill knife wasn't just for sharpening, it was a versatile tool for a scribe. The sharp tip could be used to carefully scrape away ink if you made a mistake. Parchment is very forgiving in this regard, unlike paper. The flat edge might be used for smoothing parchment or even separating stuck pages. It was your everyday multi-tool, perhaps the only truly sharp object you used regularly. You kept it close at hand, its blade probably stained with ink. A quirky tidbit is that medieval illustrations sometimes show scribes with their quill knife tucked behind their ear while they worked. Handy, but maybe not the safest place for a sharp blade. Oops, just answering the phone. Oh wait, that's my knife. Because nibs wore down and needed sharpening. And because a really good nib could make writing much easier. Scribes usually had multiple quills ready to go. You'd prepare several feathers into pens in advance, keeping them in a bundle on your desk. That way, when a nib wore out, you could quickly swap to a freshly sharpened one and keep working, saving the dull one for later sharpening. Choosing the right quill for the task at hand, feeling the flexibility of the tip, checking the ink flow, these were small sensory moments in your day. Historians still argue about the preferred bird for quills in different regions of Europe and during different periods. While geese were common, were swan quills truly superior? Did the quality of feathers vary significantly depending on where they were sourced? The practical knowledge of medieval scribes about their tools wasn't often written down in detail, making it hard for us to fully understand their preferences and techniques. As you pick up your freshly sharpened quill, feel the smooth shaft in your fingers, and test the spring of the nib on a scrap piece of parchment, you feel a sense of readiness. This simple feather, transformed by careful cutting, is your voice on the page. It is the intermediary between the ancient text before you and the new copy you are creating. You dip the finely cut nib into the ink, watch the dark liquid climb into the reservoir, and prepare for the work ahead. The slow, steady process of putting pen to parchment. Your parchment is ready. Your ink pot's filled, your quill knife sharp, and a selection of freshly cut quills sits beside you. You pick up your chosen quill, feel its familiar weight and balance in your hand. You dip the flexible nib into the black ink, letting the ink fill the small reservoir in the hollow shaft. You lift the quill, blotting any excess ink carefully on the edge of the pot or on a dedicated scrap of parchment. And then you touch the tip to the ruled line on your page. This is where the quiet rhythm truly begins. It's a process of reading, remembering, dipping, and writing, repeated thousands upon thousands of times throughout the day. You look at the exemplar text, the manuscript you are copying. You read a few words, perhaps a short phrase, committing them to memory. Then your eyes shift back to your blank page. Holding the quill at the correct angle, typically around 45-50 degrees for many medieval scripts, you begin to form the letters. Each letter is built stroke by stroke. A downstroke here, a curve there, a dot, a crossbar. The flexible nib responds to the pressure of your hand. Pressing down slightly on a downstroke makes the line thicker, lifting pressure on an upstroke makes it thinner. This variation in line width, called line contrast, is a key characteristic of many medieval scripts and gives them their beautiful rhythmic appearance. It's not just writing, it's drawing letters, each one a small piece of art. The sound is constant and central to the scriptorium atmosphere, the soft, steady scratch, scratch, scratch of the quill tip moving across the prepared parchment. Parchment, being animal skin, has a slightly fibrous texture even when smoothed, and the quill nib catches on these tiny fibers, creating that distinctive sound. It's the sound of knowledge being transferred, of words being brought into being on the page. For hours on end, this quiet scratching is the soundtrack to your work. It's oddly soothing, a constant reminder of the focused task at hand. As you write, you are not just mindlessly transcribing. You are paying close attention to the shape and form of each letter, ensuring it conforms to the style of script being used in your scriptorium or required by the exemplar. Medieval scripts like the clear and elegant Caroline minuscule, or the more condensed and angular Gothic scripts like Textura quadrata with its broken geometric forms, had specific rules for how each stroke was made. You trained for years to master these forms to make your hand consistent and legible. It's like having to write everything in a specific beautiful font, but you are the font. The pace is deliberate. You are not racing against a deadline measured in minutes. You are working at the speed of the human hand, the speed of ink flow, the speed of careful transcription. You might copy only a few pages in an entire day depending on the size of the book, the complexity of the script, and whether you are also adding decoration. A mainstream historical fact is that the production of manuscripts was a slow and painstaking process. Copying a full Bible could take a skilled scribe a year or more of continuous work. Try writing a whole novel out by hand with a feather and see how long it takes you. The rhythm of the work is punctuated by the need to re-dip your quill in the ink. A single dip might last for only a few words, or perhaps a line or two before the ink runs out and the strokes become faint and dry. So it's write, 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 dip, write, write, dip. This repeated motion becomes automatic part of the flow. You learn to feel when the quill is running low on ink, anticipating the need to dip before the letters become too weak. The concentration required is intense. Your eyes move from the exemplar to your page back and forth. Your hand must be steady. Your mind must be focused on the shapes of the letters, the spelling of the words, even if the exemplar's spelling is inconsistent. You usually copy it as is, including mistakes, and maintaining the layout of the page. It's easy to get distracted, to lose your place, to make an error. A quirky tidbit about scribal habits is that some scribes would quietly murmur the words to themselves as they copied them, perhaps to help them stay focused, or to aid in understanding, or simply to break the silence without technically speaking to anyone else. You might hear a faint low mumble from across the scriptorium, the collective sound of monks whispering ancient texts to themselves. It's like a historical ASMR whisper reading session. Historians still argue about the literacy levels of medieval scribes, particularly those who were monks. While they could clearly read and write, did they fully understand the content of every text they copied, especially complex philosophical, scientific, or legal works? Or were they sometimes primarily functioning as human copying machines, faithfully reproducing shapes and words without necessarily grasping their full meaning? The evidence is debated, and it likely varied greatly depending on the individual scribe's education and the type of text. As you continue your work, stroke after stroke, letter after letter, the outside world fades away. You are immersed in the quiet task, the feel of the quill, the sound of the scratching, the sight of the words appearing on the page. The light from the window shifts subtly as the sun rises higher. Your hand might start to ache, your back might stiffen from leaning over the desk. But for now, you are focused on the steady, gentle rhythm of copying, bringing another page of text into existence through the slow, meticulous dance of ink and quill on parchment. The steady scratch, scratch, scratch continues. Lines of black text fill the ruled spaces on your parchment. But a medieval manuscript isn't just a solid block of black ink. To make it legible, easier to read, and more visually appealing, scribes would add decoration. The most basic and common form of this was the use of red ink, a process known as rubrication. You pause your black ink writing. Perhaps you've reached the end of a chapter, a significant section, or just a paragraph break where a large initial letter is needed. You put down your black ink quill and pick up a different one, or perhaps just a different brush, and reach for the pot of vibrant red ink. This red ink, often made from cinnabar or madder, provides a striking contrast against the black text and the pale parchment. A mainstream historical fact is that rubrication, the use of red ink for titles, headings, and initials, was standard practice in medieval manuscripts to highlight key elements and structure the text visually. The purpose of rubrication was practical as well as decorative. In a manuscript written in a dense script without spaces between words, which was common in earlier periods, imagine reading that headings and initial letters in red helped the reader navigate the text. They signaled the start of new sections, highlighted important names or phrases, and generally made the page less intimidating. It was the medieval equivalent of using bold text headings and bullet points in a document. Except, done by hand with red ink and much slower. The process could happen in a couple of ways. Sometimes the main scribe copying the black text would leave blank spaces where the red text or initials were supposed to go. These spaces would then be filled in later by the same scribe, or in larger scriptoria by a specialist called a rubricator. Imagine finishing a page of black text, seeing all the empty spaces, and knowing you have to come back and fill them all in with red. A bit like doing homework in 2 stages. Alternatively, a scribe might switch back and forth between black and red ink as they copied, which required more focus but meant the page was finished as they went. The tools for rubrication were similar to those for writing, but often included finer tipped quills for delicate lines or small brushes for filling in larger initial letters. You dip your red ink quill or brush into the pot. The red pigment, if it's mineral-based, might have a slightly grainy texture compared to the black ink, or it might be smooth and flowing. You carefully fill in the blank space, maybe writing a title in red letters at the top of the page or writing a chapter heading within the text block. Then there are the initial letters. At the start of a new section or paragraph, you might leave a space for a larger capital letter. Sometimes this initial was just a plain capital letter, written in red larger than the surrounding text, but often even these simple initials would have basic decorative flourishes. Perhaps the strokes of the letter would extend into simple spirals, knots, or foliate leafy designs. These weren't full-blown illustrations yet, but they added a touch of artistry to the page. It's like adding a fancy font for your capital letters, just with a lot more effort involved. The act of adding these flourishes requires a slightly different hand movement than the main script. It's less about strict adherence to letter forms and more about fluid strokes and design. You might practice these flourishes on scrap parchment before committing them to the main page. The red ink flows onto the parchment, its brightness catching the light. It adds life to the page, breaking up the monochromatic landscape of black text. A quirky tidbit related to rubrication is the practice of scribes leaving small notes or instructions in the margins for the rubricator or illuminator, such as Redehunks rubrica. Make this red or even little sketches of the design intended for an initial. These notes, often later erased or trimmed off when the book was bound, give us fascinating glimpses into the collaborative process of manuscript production and show that communication, albeit silent or written, was necessary. Imagine leaving a sticky note on your coworker's desk that says, "Add glitter here." Historians still argue about the division of labor in scriptoria regarding rubrication and illumination. Was it always separate from the main scribal work done by different individuals? Or did many scribes perform all these tasks themselves, simply switching tools and inks? The evidence suggests it varied depending on the size and specialization of the scriptorium and the complexity of the decoration required. Some manuscripts show inconsistencies that suggest different hands were at work. As you add the final touches of red to a heading or complete a simple decorative initial, you feel a small sense of satisfaction. The page is coming alive. The red provides visual structure and beauty. It's a different kind of concentration than copying the main text, a more design-focused task. The vibrant red ink is a welcome splash of color, a reminder that even in the quiet, serious work of the scriptorium, there was room for beauty and careful embellishment. The page is ready for the next potential layer of decoration, the more complex and colorful world of illumination. Your page is coming along. The black text is neatly copied within its ruled lines, punctuated by the vibrant red of headings and initials. But some manuscripts were destined for far greater visual splendor. This is where the art of illumination comes in. Illumination, from the Latin word illuminare, meaning to light up, involved adding illustrations, intricate decorative borders, and often stunning, highly detailed initial letters that were far more complex than simple rubrication. If the manuscript you are working on is meant to be particularly special, perhaps a Bible for the monastery's altar, a book of hours for a wealthy patron, or a scientific text requiring diagrams, you, or more likely a specialized illuminator, would turn the page into a work of art. While basic scribes copied the text, illumination was a different skill requiring artistic talent and mastery of working with precious materials like gold leaf and expensive pigments. A mainstream historical fact is that manuscript illumination was a major art form in the Middle Ages, producing some of the most beautiful and enduring examples of medieval painting and design. The process of illumination often began with the artist sketching the design onto the parchment in faint lead or ink. Then came the gilding, the application of gold leaf. A sticky substance, perhaps egg white or gesso, a mixture of plaster and glue, would be applied to the areas where gold was desired. Then incredibly thin sheets of gold leaf were carefully laid over the adhesive. Once dry, the excess gold would be brushed away, leaving a brilliant metallic surface that would catch and reflect the light. This gold literally illuminated the page, giving it a sense of radiance and luxury. Imagine working with something so delicate and precious. One wrong breath and your expensive gold is gone. After the gold was applied and burnished rubbed to make it shiny, the painting began. Using the colored pigments prepared earlier, the blues from lapis lazuli, the reds from cinnabar, the greens from copper, the illuminator would apply layers of paint with fine brushes made from animal hair. The details could be incredibly small and intricate, requiring immense patience and a steady hand. You might paint miniature scenes depicting events from the text portraits of saints or figures, fanciful creatures, or elaborate patterns filling borders and initial letters. The initial letters themselves could become whole worlds. What started as a simple capital letter in the main text would be transformed into a large, decorative initial filling several lines or even a significant portion of the page. These illuminated initials might contain tiny narrative scenes within their curves, or be interwoven with complex knotwork swirling vines and fantastical animals. They weren't just letters, they were miniature paintings in themselves. The sensory experience of illumination is about vibrant color and shimmering light. The deep blues, rich reds, emerald greens, and sunny yellows pop against the pale parchment. And the gold gleams and shifts as the light catches it, giving the page a sense of life and movement that the black and red text alone couldn't provide. It's like the difference between a black and white photograph and a full-color high-definition image with sparkly bits added. Beyond the main illustrations and initials, illuminators would often decorate the margins of the page with elaborate borders of foliage flowers or geometric patterns. And sometimes they would add strange, often humorous drawings in the margins called marginalia. These could be depictions of everyday life, funny caricatures, bizarre hybrid creatures, part human part, animal part plant, or even scenes that seem completely unrelated to the main text. A quirky tidbit about marginalia is that they often featured animals behaving badly, people doing silly things, or strange, grotesque figures. It's like the medieval version of doodling in the margins of your notebook, but elevated to an art form that has kept scholars entertained for centuries. Why is that rabbit fighting a snail? We may never know, but it's certainly memorable. Historians still argue about the meaning and purpose of marginalia. Were they purely decorative and humorous, a bit of light relief from the serious text? Did they hold hidden symbolic meanings? Or were some simply the result of scribes or illuminators getting bored and letting their imaginations run wild? The diverse and often puzzling nature of marginalia makes them a fascinating area of study. There's also scholarly debate about the level of collaboration between the scribe who copied the text and the illuminator who added the images. Did they work closely together, planning the layout and illustrations in advance? Or did the illuminator simply add their artwork into spaces left blank by the scribe? Working on an illuminated manuscript, whether you were the scribe leaving space or the illuminator filling it, brought a different kind of focus. It was less about the steady rhythm of copying words and more about meticulous detail color mixing and artistic vision. It was a slower process than simple copying, requiring even more patience. The finished product was a treasure, a unique work of art that combined text and image to convey knowledge and beauty. As you look at the vibrant colors and gleaming gold on a page, you see the result of painstaking work, a testament to the skill and artistry that went into creating these illuminated windows into the medieval world. While the pages you create can be beautiful, filled with elegant script and vibrant colors, the actual work of being a scribe wasn't always glamorous. It was physically demanding and could be intensely monotonous. You spent hours each day hunched over a desk, often in less than ideal conditions, performing repetitive tasks. This took a toll on the body. Remember that scriptorium. While sometimes located near a warmer area, it wasn't likely heated to modern comfortable levels, especially in winter. Stone buildings hold the cold, and sitting still for long periods in a drafty room was simply part of the reality. Your fingers could get stiff and cold, making the delicate work of cutting quills and forming letters even harder. Imagine trying to write neatly when your hands feel like frozen claws. Not ideal. This wasn't just uncomfortable. Prolonged exposure to cold and damp contributed to various ailments that medieval people faced. Beyond the cold, the posture required for copying was tough on the body. Leaning over a sloping desk, keeping your back bent and your neck craned to focus on the text and your page hour after hour, day after day. This inevitably led to aches and pains. Back strain, neck stiffness, and shoulder pain were probably constant companions. You likely developed a permanent hunch. Try sitting perfectly still and focused for 8 hours straight without slouching. It's almost impossible even in a comfortable chair. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval scribes suffered from various physical ailments due to their working conditions, including back problems, eye strain, and hand cramps from the repetitive motion of writing. And then there were the hand cramps. Gripping a quill, maintaining consistent pressure, forming thousands of tiny strokes, your hand and wrist would ache sometimes intensely. The scribe's cramp was a very real occupational hazard. You'd have to pause, flex your fingers, massage your hand, maybe even dip it in warm water if any was available, unlikely in a cold scriptorium. But a scribe can dream. It's the ancient equivalent of getting carpal tunnel syndrome, but from writing instead of typing. You probably needed a medieval chiropractor, and if such a thing existed. Beyond the physical discomfort, there was the mental challenge, the sheer monotony of copying. day after day, page after page, reproducing text that you might or might not fully understand, remember that scholarly debate. While some texts were fascinating, others might have been repetitive legal documents, dry theological treatises, or endless lists. Maintaining focus for hours on end, avoiding errors, keeping your hand consistent. It required incredible mental discipline. Boredom was a constant threat. You might find yourself occasionally letting your mind wander, staring out the window at the monastery garden, or getting momentarily lost in the patterns of the wood grain on your desk. Sometimes the desire to break the monotony was overwhelming. This is perhaps where some of those quirky marginalia doodles came from. A brief creative rebellion against the endless lines of text. Drawing a rabbit fighting a snail was probably more interesting than copying the 50th page of a sermon. It was a way to keep your brain from turning into parchment paste. Scribes developed little strategies to cope. Taking short breaks to stand up and stretch, walking a few steps around the scriptorium, silently of course, or perhaps rubbing a soothing balm onto aching joints. The murmuring of words we talked about earlier wasn't just for focus. It might have been a way to break the silence and the mental isolation of the work, a small sound, to anchor your attention when your mind wanted to drift off to, well, anywhere but the page. You probably perfected the art of looking intensely focused while secretly planning your next marginal doodle. A quirky tidbit from actual medieval manuscripts is that scribes sometimes left little notes or verses in the margins. Or at the end of the book, colophons complaining about their difficult work, the cold, the bad ink, or even expressing relief at finishing a particularly long or tedious text. One famous example reads, "Thank God I am finished, write well my hand." Another complained about the ink, "Ink, you are bad." These little notes offer a human connection across the centuries, reminding us that behind the beautiful script were real people dealing with real job frustrations. Imagine leaving a passive-aggressive note about the office supplies. Historians still argue about the average lifespan and health status of medieval monks and scribes compared to the general population. While monastic life offered some advantages like regular food and shelter, the cold, damp environment, limited diet, and specific physical stresses of scribal work likely took their toll. Were they healthier overall due to a more regulated life, or did their working conditions balance out those benefits? It's hard to say definitively from the available evidence. So as you sit there, quill in hand facing another page of text, be aware of the physical realities of your job. The stiffness in your back, the ache in your wrist, the cold air on your face. These discomforts were part of the daily life of a medieval scribe, a quiet battle fought against the body's protestations and the mind's desire for distraction. But the work continued because the text needed to be copied, the knowledge preserved. And in that quiet, persistent effort, there was a different kind of strength, a dedication that transcended the physical discomfort. You sit at your desk, the physical discomfort a familiar ache, the sounds of scratching quills a constant presence. But the most engaging part of your day beyond the mechanics of putting ink to parchment is the content of the text that passed through your hands. As a scribe in a medieval monastery, you are a gatekeeper and transmitter of knowledge, copying works that range from the most sacred to the surprisingly mundane. The core of any monastic library would be the Bible and various liturgical texts, the books needed for the daily prayers and services. You would spend countless hours copying scripture psalters, missals, and breviaries. These were the most important texts, the spiritual foundation of the monastery's life, and copying them was considered a devout act in itself. Handling these books, feeling the weight of the ancient words, was a connection to centuries of faith and tradition. But monasteries weren't just focused on religious texts. They were often the only places where other forms of knowledge were preserved and studied. You might find yourself copying the works of the great church fathers like Augustine or Jerome, delving into their theological arguments and interpretations of Scripture. Or you could be tasked with copying works from classical antiquity, the writings of Roman authors like Virgil, Cicero, or Ovid. Copying these ancient texts, sometimes centuries old, written in classical Latin, that felt slightly different from the Latin you used every day, was a direct link to a world long past. It was like time travel, but powered by a quill and ink. Beyond religious and classical literature, monastic libraries often contained historical chronicles recording the events of the local region or the wider world. You might copy texts on philosophy, grammar, rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking and writing, and even early scientific or medical texts, though these were often based on ancient knowledge rather than experimentation. Imagine copying a medical text that recommends rubbing crocodile dung on yourself. Remember that from our Roman journey. Probably makes you question the knowledge you're preserving a little bit. The variety of texts meant your work was not always the same. One week you might be copying the Psalms in a careful, reverent hand. The next you might be struggling with the complex syntax of a Roman orator, or the dry details of a monastic land charter. Some texts would be familiar and comforting. Others might be challenging, or even, dare I say it, a bit boring. Copying a long list of property holdings probably wasn't as exciting as copying a dramatic passage from Virgil's Aeneid, even if the Virgil required more focus to get the Latin right. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval monasteries were vital centers for the preservation and copying of a wide range of texts encompassing religious, classical, historical, and sometimes scientific knowledge. They were the libraries and publishing houses of their time. Handling these ancient manuscripts, the exemplars you copied from, was a tactile experience. You felt the weight of the heavy bindings, the texture of the old parchment, the faded ink of hands that had copied these very words centuries before yours. It was a physical connection to the chain of knowledge, a reminder that you were just one link carefully passing on the words for the next generation of scribes and readers. It gave your quiet, repetitive work a sense of profound importance. You might encounter texts that were famous even then, like illuminated Bibles known for their beauty, or key philosophical works that were debated throughout Europe. Copying such a renowned text must have added a layer of pressure. You didn't want to be the scribe who messed up the most important book in the library. You probably double-checked those particularly significant passages. It's like being asked to hand copy the Magna Carta. No pressure. A quirky tidbit is that within the pages of these ancient books, you might sometimes find unexpected things. Scribes occasionally left little notes or marginalia beyond the drawings about where they got the exemplar from when they finished copying it, or even personal comments about the text itself. Maybe a complaint about the difficulty of the Latin, or a note correcting an error they spotted in the original. These tiny glimpses into the scribe's interaction with the text offer a personal connection across the centuries. Imagine finding a note in the margin of a Bible that just says, "This part is confusing." Relatable even 1,000 years later. Historians still argue about the criteria medieval monasteries used for selecting which text to copy and preserve. Was it purely based on religious importance? Did they prioritize texts needed for teaching within the monastery? Or did patronage play a significant role with wealthy individuals commissioning copies of specific secular or classical works? The mix of texts in surviving libraries suggests a complex set of motivations, and it's hard to pinpoint a single driving force behind every copying decision. As you carefully form the letters of the text before you, your mind engaged with the words, your hand engaged with the quill, you are part of a continuous flow of knowledge stretching back to antiquity. The texts you copy, whether sacred or secular, are the foundation of medieval learning. Your quiet, painstaking work ensures that these words will survive to be read and copied by others in the future. It gives meaning to the repetitive nature of your days in the scriptorium, knowing that the knowledge passing through your hands is being preserved for posterity. Our journey into the quiet life of a scribe has focused primarily on the monastic scriptorium, a place of silenced devotion and the painstaking copying of texts, often religious ones. For much of the early Middle Ages, monasteries were indeed the most important centers of book production and literacy. But as the medieval period progressed, and as towns and cities grew, and as kings and nobles needed their own records, kept another type of scribe became increasingly important, the lay scribe. These were individuals who were not monks or clergy. They were secular people working outside the walls of the monastery. Their workspaces and their daily lives were often very different from the quiet, regulated environment of the scriptorium we've been exploring. Instead of the stillness of a monastery, a lay scribe might work in the bustling, noisy environment of a royal court, a noble household, or later in the period, a nascent university or a busy town center. Imagine being a lay scribe in the service of a king or a wealthy merchant. Your scriptorium might be a corner of a drafty castle hall filled with the sounds of servant soldiers and courtiers. Or it could be a small, perhaps slightly less chaotic room in a townhouse. You might work alongside a handful of other scribes dealing not in ancient Bibles or theological treatises, but in charters, legal documents, administrative records, business accounts, and letters. The focus here was often on practical necessity and efficiency, perhaps less on artistic beauty, unless you were working for a particularly fancy noble who wanted illuminated documents. A mainstream historical fact is that The rise of literacy among the lay population, particularly in urban centers and royal courts, led to an increasing demand for secular scribes who could read and write for administrative, legal, and commercial purposes. The texts you copied or composed as a lay scribe were often in the vernacular language, English, French, German, etc., as well as Latin. This was especially true as more people outside the clergy became literate and needed documents they could understand. Your tools might be similar. Quills, ink, parchment. Though paper started becoming more available and might be used for less formal documents. But the pace might be dictated by the demands of your employer, not the rhythm of monastic prayer. You might be expected to produce documents quickly, even if it meant a slightly less perfect hand than you'd strive for in a monastic setting. It's like the difference between writing a personal journal beautifully and typing out a quick email at work. The environment of a lay scribe could be much less controlled than a monastic scriptorium. Instead of dedicated carols by quiet windows, you might be working at a shared table surrounded by the noise and activity of a busy household or office. The distractions wouldn't be a monk shuffling his feet, but perhaps a dog barking, people talking loudly, or messengers coming and going. Maintaining focus would require a different kind of discipline, perhaps less about enforced silence and more about being able to tune out chaos. Imagine trying to write a legal contract with a parrot squawking nearby. Adds a certain je ne sais quoi to the proceedings. Lay scribes played a crucial role in the development of medieval society. They enabled governments to keep records, businesses to conduct transactions, and individuals to formalize agreements. They were the keepers of secular memory, just as monastic scribes were the keepers of religious and classical knowledge. While monastic scriptoria focused on preserving the past, lay scribes were often focused on documenting the present and shaping the future through legal and administrative texts. A quirky tidbit about lay scribes is that some towns and cities developed official notarial systems, where scribes called notaries were legally authorized to draw up and certify documents like wills, contracts, and property deeds. These notaries often had their own offices and seals, and their work was essential for the functioning of urban life. Imagine the medieval version of a notary public's office. Probably smelled less like old parchment and more like, well, a medieval town. Historians still argue about the exact relationship and cross-pollination between monastic scriptoria and lay scribal centers. Did lay scribes learn their skills in monasteries? Did techniques and script styles flow between the two worlds? Or did they develop largely independently, shaped by their different purposes and environments? The evidence is complex, suggesting some overlap and influence, but also distinct traditions. It's hard to know how much a city notary had in common in terms of daily work experience with a monk copying a Bible. As you sit in your quiet scriptorium, perhaps hearing only the gentle scratching of quills, remember that elsewhere in the medieval world, other scribes were working by different rhythms in different spaces, putting quill to parchment for different purposes. Their lives were perhaps less cloistered, potentially more directly involved in the secular world's comings and goings. But they shared the fundamental skills, the careful hand, and the dedication to the written word that defined the scribe, monastic or lay. The world of medieval writing was broader than just the monastery, encompassing bustling courts and busy town squares, though perhaps lacking the profound stillness you experience here. Back in the quiet scriptorium, the steady rhythm of copying continues. Pages fill with text, illuminated initials, sparkle, red headings stand out. But despite the concentration, despite the careful preparation of tools and materials, and despite your skill, mistakes happen. You are human after all, and hours of repetitive work. Sometimes in dim light, sometimes with an imperfect exemplar, inevitably lead to slips of the hand or lapses in attention. An ink blot could fall onto the page, smearing the fresh, wet ink. You might miscopy a word from the exemplar, transposing letters, or substituting one word for another that looks similar. You could accidentally skip a line or even a whole passage, completely disrupting the flow of the text. Or perhaps in a moment of fatigue, your hand trembles and a perfectly formed letter turns into a messy squiggle. Ah, the joys of manual transcription. It's like getting a typo in an email, but this typo is permanent unless you fix it carefully, and there's no delete button. Parchment, thankfully, is relatively forgiving. If the ink hasn't dried completely, sometimes you can gently blot it away. But for more permanent errors, especially dried ink or significant blots, the primary method of correction involved your trusty quill knife, or sometimes a small specialized scraper. You use the tip of the sharp knife or scraper, and very, very carefully with a light touch scrape away the top layer of the parchment where the error sits. It's a delicate operation. Scrape too hard and you thin the parchment, potentially creating a weak spot or even a hole. Scrape too lightly and the ink remains. It requires a steady hand and intense focus, particularly on such a precious and expensive material. The sound is a soft, scraping whisper against the parchment, a sound of rectification, a tiny moment of undoing the mistake. Once the ink has been scraped away, leaving a slightly roughened patch on the parchment surface, you can then attempt to write over that area. You might need to smooth the scraped spot first with a bone folder or your thumbnail to prepare it to receive ink again. Writing on a scraped area can be tricky. The ink might spread slightly differently or the texture might be visible if you look closely. The goal was to make the correction as invisible as possible, integrating it seamlessly back into the text. It was the medieval version of using correction fluid, but way more laborious and requiring actual skill, and probably more likely to result in a visible patch that screamed, "A mistake happened here." For larger errors like skipping an entire line or passage, simply scraping might not be sufficient. In such cases, you might have to add the missing text in the margin, indicating its place in the main text with a symbol. Or in the worst-case scenario for a really significant error, or a large irreparable smudge, you might have to discard the entire sheet of parchment and start that portion over. Given the cost and labor involved in making parchment, this was a painful and wasteful event, probably accompanied by a quiet sigh of frustration. Silently, of course. Well, there goes Brother Bartholomew the calf. The pressure to be accurate was high, especially when copying important texts like scripture or legal documents. An error could change the meaning of a passage or invalidate a legal agreement. This is why concentration was so important and why mistakes were so frustrating. Scribes developed various techniques to try and prevent errors, like reading the text aloud quietly as they copied. Remember the murmuring or having another scribe read the exemplar while they wrote? A mainstream historical fact is that despite efforts to be accurate, errors and variations inevitably crept into manuscripts during the copying process, leading to textual differences between copies of the same work. This is why modern scholars studying medieval texts have to compare multiple versions to figure out the original wording. A quirky tidbit is that some scribes, instead of just scraping away errors, would sometimes draw a line through the mistaken word and then write vacat Latin for "it is empty" or "it is cancelled," or del for "della delete" in the margin. Other times they might make a small dot under each letter of the incorrect word. It's like using the strike-through function on your computer, but much more manual. Another quirky thing, some errors are clearly the result of the scribe's eye jumping to the wrong line in the exemplar, especially if two lines started or ended with the same words. It's called homoiotoluton or homoiobarcton. Fancy names for basically getting lost in the text because everything looks the same. Relatable for anyone who's ever proofread a long document. Historians still argue about the typical error rate in medieval manuscripts. How accurate on average were scribes in reproducing texts? Did accuracy improve over time or with different types of texts? How widespread were practices like proofreading? Having a second scribe check the copy against the exemplar in different scriptoria. The evidence is scattered and comparing error rates across different manuscripts and scriptoria is challenging. As you carefully scrape away a misplaced dot or rewrite a wobbly letter, you are engaged in the constant battle against imperfection. Mistakes are part of the process humanizing elements in these otherwise seemingly perfect objects. The smudges, the corrections, the marginal notes about errors. These are the fingerprints of the scribe, reminders of the real person behind the careful script, quietly working, occasionally messing up and doing their best to correct it in a world without backspace keys or correction fluid. The silence of the scriptorium is occasionally punctuated by the soft scrape of the knife, the sound of a mistake being undone. The light begins to fade. The gray light that filtered through the scriptorium windows hours ago has started to soften, turning warmer, more yellow, and then slowly dimming. The natural light, your most important resource for detailed work, is running out. This is the primary signal that the copying session is coming to an end. The strict monastic schedule dictated by the canonical hours will also have its own signals. The bell for Vespers, the evening prayer service. You look at the page you are working on. You might try to finish the sentence or perhaps the paragraph before stopping for the day. Rushing now would only lead to more mistakes, and the light is getting poor for fine work anyway. You lay down your quill, perhaps after writing the last stroke of the day. The sound of scratching slowly diminishes around the room as other scribes also cease their work. Ink takes time to dry, especially the dark black writing ink. You need to be careful not to smudge the fresh lines. You might leave the page open on your desk for a few moments to allow the ink to dry completely before handling it further. The vibrant red of the rubrication and the rich colors of any illumination will also need time to set. Patience is key even when you're ready to be done for the day. You carefully clean your quill, wiping off the excess ink with a cloth or a scrap of parchment. You place it with your other quills. You cap or cover your ink pots to keep the ink from drying out overnight. Your quill, knife, ruler, and other tools are gathered and put away perhaps in a small pouch or box you keep at your desk. It's important to mark your place. You might place a thin strip of parchment or a simple cord in the exemplar manuscript to show where you stopped copying. You do the same for your own copy, marking the exact line where you will resume tomorrow. This prevents you from losing your place in either text, which would be a frustrating way to start the next day. Imagine spending 10 minutes searching for where you left off in a massive book. No thanks. There's a quiet sense of accomplishment that comes with finishing a page or even just a significant portion of a page for the day. Each completed section is a small step forward in the long process of copying an entire manuscript. You can see the progress, the growing stack of finished folios, the folded sheets of parchment that will eventually make up the book. It's a tangible result of your day's quiet labor. A mainstream historical fact is that the scribe's working day was largely dictated by the availability of natural light beginning at dawn and ending at dusk, particularly for the demanding work of copying fine script. No overtime under fluorescent lights here. You might carefully close the exemplar manuscript, protecting its precious pages. Your own unfinished folio is covered as well, perhaps with a piece of cloth or another blank sheet to keep it clean and flat overnight. The room is growing dim now, the details blurring in the fading light. The air feels cooler as the sun's warmth diminishes. The sounds of work have stopped, replaced by the quiet sounds of packing up. The soft closing of ink pots, the gentle rustle of parchment. Leaving the scriptorium at the end of the day is a quiet transition. The shared, focused energy of the room dissipates. Other scribes are also gathering their things, preparing to head to vespers or other evening duties. You exchange silent nods or perhaps use a hand signal. Finished for the day. See you tomorrow. The light from the windows is now barely sufficient to navigate by. You might need to carry your small lamp or candle again as you leave the scriptorium and make your way through the monastery corridors towards the church for evening prayer or towards your cell. A quirky tidbit about scribes finishing their work is that some would write a phrase called an explicit at the very end of the text they were copying, or sometimes at the end of a section or a volume, indicating that the work was finished. This is the opposite of an incipit, which is the opening phrase of a text. The word explicit comes from the Latin explicitus est libero, meaning the book is unrolled, referring to scrolls or the book is finished. It's where we get our modern word explicit, but it just meant the end in this context. Imagine getting to the last page of a really long book and writing explicit with a flourish. Satisfying. Historians still argue about the exact length of the working day in medieval scriptoria, as it would vary significantly depending on the season. More light in summer, less in winter, and the specific rules of the monastic order. Some rules might have allowed for short periods of work by artificial light, but the bulk of the detailed copying had to be done during daylight hours. It's hard to know how many hours a day on average a scribe actually spent with a quill in hand, putting ink to parchment. As you leave the scriptorium, the quiet work of the day behind you, you feel the relaxation that comes with completing a task. Your hands might still ache, your back might still be stiff, but the page is filled. The words are copied, and you have done your part in the long, slow process of preserving knowledge. The fading light signals the end of the working day, a time for rest and quiet contemplation before the cycle begins again tomorrow. The tools are put away, the ink is covered, the parchment is protected. The scriptorium settles into darkness, waiting for the dawn. Leaving the scriptorium as the natural light fails marks the transition from the focused work of the day to the quieter rhythms of the monastic evening. The air in the corridors is cooler, and the sense of directed activity has shifted towards communal and personal winding down. Your time is now dedicated to prayer, simple sustenance, and preparing for rest. You might head directly to the monastery church for vespers, the evening prayer service held as dusk settles. The church, too, will be dimly lit by a few lamps or candles, creating an atmosphere of solemnity and reflection. The voices of the monks chanting fill the space, a soothing, repetitive sound that contrasts with the silence of the scriptorium or the sporadic noises of the daytime monastery. This communal prayer is a central part of the evening, a spiritual closing to the day. A mainstream historical fact is that the monastic day was strictly structured around a series of prayer services known as the Liturgy of the Hours, performed at set times throughout the day and night, including Vespers and Compline in the evening. After Vespers, there would likely be the evening meal, often called cena or supper, though it was usually a much lighter affair than the main meal of the day, which was often eaten earlier. In many monastic rules, this evening meal was simple: bread, vegetables, perhaps some legumes or cheese. Meat was often restricted or forbidden, particularly during fasting periods. The meal would likely be eaten in silence in the refectory while a monk read aloud from a religious text. Imagine eating your soup in silence every night while someone reads sermons to you. Not exactly lively dinner conversation. The lighting in the refectory during the meal would be provided by lamps or candles. While perhaps a bit brighter than the church, it would still be far dimmer than any modern dining room. Enough to see your simple food and the faces of your fellow monks across the table, but not bright enough for reading or detailed work. The smells would be those of the simple meal mingling with the faint aroma of lamp oil or candle wax. After the evening meal, depending on the specific rules of your monastic order and the time of year, there might be a period for quiet activities. This could include personal prayer reading, again by the dim light of a lamp or candle, likely strenuous on the eyes, or perhaps some light manual work if permitted. Some monastic rules allowed for a period of communal reading or discussion, though often still in a quiet, subdued manner. It was a time to transition from the focused work of the day to a state of rest and contemplation. Then comes Compline, the final prayer service of the day, often held just before the monks retired for the night. This service is typically short and focused on themes of protection during the night and preparation for death. It's a quiet, introspective service, a final communal act before the great silence of the night descends upon the monastery. After Compline, strict silence is observed until the first service before dawn. No late-night snacks or whispering ghost stories in the dorms. Preparing for bed in a medieval monastery was a simple affair. Your cell likely contains only a bed or straw mattress, perhaps a small stool or chest. There would be no elaborate nighttime rituals. The light in your cell, if you were permitted a lamp or candle at all, would be minimal. Just enough to get ready and perhaps for a very brief period of reading if allowed. Many monks likely retired to near total darkness, guided to their beds by memory and the faint light from the corridor or moon. The atmosphere of the monastery in the evening is one of deepening quiet and stillness. The daytime sounds of work movement and limited conversation fade away. The dominant sounds are the sounds of prayer, the soft shuffle of feet, the distant closing of doors, the occasional hoot of an owl from outside. The air grows colder, especially in the unheated cells. The world outside the monastery walls feels even more distant and irrelevant in this insulated, quiet space. A quirky tidbit about monastic evening routines is that some orders had a specific time called the collation, which was originally a reading from a text but evolved in some places into a light evening snack before Compline. So that simple meal after Vespers might have been supplemented by a tiny late-night bite. Imagine looking forward to your nightly collation of maybe just a piece of bread and water. Living it up. Another quirky fact: in some larger monasteries, there might be a specific monk whose job it was to go around after Compline and ensure that all lights were out and silence was being observed. The medieval equivalent of the resident advisor, probably not the most popular monk. Historians still argue about the amount of strictly individual time versus communal time within monastic schedules, particularly in the evenings. Did monks have significant periods for private study and contemplation? Or was their time almost entirely dictated by communal activities and prayer? The rules of different orders varied, and the actual practice likely differed from the ideal. It's hard to know how much alone time you'd truly have after your scribal duties were done. As you settle into your cell, the dim light of a small lamp or candle casting long shadows, the sounds of the monastery fading into silence, you feel the day fully receding. The hours spent copying the ache in your hand, the concentration on the text, they are all part of the day that is now ending. The evening rituals, the prayers, the quiet meal, the limited light, they have all guided you towards this moment of rest. The world outside is dark, and your own small world within the monastery is preparing for the deep quiet of the night. The light is dimming, signaling that it is time to release the day and prepare for sleep. The evening services are complete, the simple meal is eaten in silence, and the brief period for quiet activity is drawing to a close. You are in your cell, a small Spartan room that is your private space in the monastery. If you are permitted a light source, it is likely a single small lamp or candle, casting a very limited circle of illumination in the otherwise deep gloom. This is the final light you will see before the profound darkness of the monastic night descends. You reach for the lamp or candle. There's no dramatic fanfare to this moment, just the quiet, practical act of extinguishing the flame. You might use a snuffer, a small cone on a handle to gently deprive the wick of oxygen, or perhaps carefully pinch the wick between your fingers if it's a candle risky but done. The tiny flame sputters for a moment, then dies, leaving behind a thin wisp of smoke and the faint smell of oil or wax. And then, darkness. Total or near total darkness. The faint light from the moon or stars might filter through a small window if there is one and the sky is clear. But within the stone walls of the monastery, the night is deep. The sounds of the monastery have ceased. The great silence has begun. Your other senses become more prominent in the absence of light. You hear the sounds of your own body. You're breathing the blood pulsing in your ears. You feel the rough texture of your blanket, the cool air on your face. This darkness is not the patchy, uncertain darkness of the Roman city we explored, previously punctuated by distant working fires or patrolling watchmen. This is a more complete, enveloping dark. It is the darkness that medieval people were intimately familiar with the natural state of the world after the sunset, largely undisturbed by artificial light. It is a darkness that encourages rest, that removes the visual distractions of the world. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval monastic life involved periods of profound silence and near total darkness during the night as part of the discipline and focus on prayer and contemplation. As you lie there in the dark, perhaps pulling your simple wool blanket tighter against the chill, your mind might replay fragments of the day. The feel of the parchment, the sound of your quill, scratching the shapes of the letters you formed. The words of the text you copied, perhaps a passage from the Bible or a line from a Roman poet or dry legal phrase. You might recall the vibrant colors of an illuminated initial, or the quiet satisfaction of finishing a page, or the frustration of a mistake that required careful scraping. Your body is tired from the long hours spent sitting and writing. Your hands might still ache faintly, but the work is done. The texts are safe for the night, waiting for the light of dawn to resume their journey onto the page. The monastery is asleep around you, a world of quiet dedication and faith. This quiet, dark conclusion to the day is a stark contrast to the activity and light of the daytime scriptorium. It is a necessary balance, a period of rest and recovery before the early bell rings and the cycle begins again. You know that bell will come soon, long before the sun rises. The monastic rhythm demands it. But for now, there's only the darkness, the silence, and the feeling of your body preparing for sleep. A quirky tidbit is that some monks would sleep with a small bag or pillow of aromatic herbs near their heads, believed to ward off bad dreams or promote restful sleep. Imagine trying to fall asleep sniffing lavender and rosemary medieval style. Another quirky fact, even in the deepest night silence monasteries, might have a designated night watch monk whose job was to stay awake for certain periods. Perhaps to check for fires, always a risk even with minimal light, or ensure others were observing the silence. No peace even for the night watchman. Historians still argue about the psychological effects of living with such strict rules about silence and limited artificial light. Did it promote deeper contemplation and spiritual insight as intended? Or did the lack of stimulation and constant darkness lead to other challenges? Our modern lives are so filled with light and noise that it's hard to fully grasp what it would be like to live in that level of quiet and dark every night. But as you lie there, letting your body relax, feeling the heaviness in your limbs, you are part of an ancient tradition of preparing for sleep after a day defined by quiet, meticulous work. The last visual trace of the day, the small flame, has vanished. The sounds of work and prayer have faded. There is only the gentle rhythm of your own breathing, the silence of the monastery, and the enveloping darkness. Now, as the quiet deepens around you, feel yourself sinking into the stillness of the medieval night. The stone walls of your cell hold you in a peaceful embrace. The sounds of the day, the scratching of quills, the chanting in the church, the faint whispers of conversation all fade into the distance. Your breath is soft even. Imagine the darkness in the room, complete and restful. There is nothing left to see, nothing left to do, but simply B. Let the thoughts of the day, the texts, the inks, the quills drift away like smoke. You are safe, you are quiet, you are at rest. The long, quiet life of the scribe is settling down for the night, and so are you.